Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. Couple of reminders. Please mute yourself as you join the meeting. And I'll try to stay on top of that, but sometimes you accidentally unmute yourself. So please make sure you mute yourself so that it doesn't interrupt the presentation. I am, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Janita Oliveras. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at Tyler, and I am the project manager for the SEE Belize grant, the one that led the efforts to write it and had the privilege of leading the team in the implementation of the work. I want to remind you that we need to take attendance, especially for those that are part of the project. So please type your name in the chat and your institution. If you're a teacher, please also include that in your post. I want to bring your attention to what Ms. Lane has in the screen, and it's an access to an earpod. And we are asking that only teachers that are part of the project, so you've been notified that you will be assigned a field supervisors for this project, that you join that Nearpod. Nearpod has a limited capacity, so we want to make sure that those that are participating in the project access the Nearpod first. You will be able to see the Nearpod even if you're not joining it, so because Jennifer will be projecting it, but I want to make sure that we want to make sure that only those that are part of the teachers that are going to be in the project sign in through that. If you're an intern and you are at UB Toledo or Stan Creek Ecumenical Junior College, you can also join the Nearpod. Only interns and teachers from those two colleges or a university or teachers, newly qualified teachers that have been invited to be part of the project. If we have more room, once we get started, Jennifer will let us know and other teachers can join, but for now, please limit your attendance to or you joining to the Nearpod if you're part of the project. I'm going to introduce Jennifer so she can explain how to join the Nearpod and make sure that she can answer your questions about that. So I'm just here to welcome you and thank you for being here. We are very excited to have such a great response and welcome from you all as we implement this project. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer. Jennifer is the director of secondary curriculum in Lindale Independent School District here in Texas, in East Texas. And she traveled with us. She has traveled with us to Belize a number of times and is actually the lead trainer for the instructional piece of this project. So I'm going to turn it over to her and let her answer any questions you might have and let this session get started. Thank you for being here, Jennifer. You're on.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. If you were able to attend either virtually or in person the training that we had just a few weeks ago, I was with Dr. Forrest Kaiser as we went through some of the beginning elements and we went through the teacher guidebook and everything like that. So I did notice a couple of names. I recognize a couple of names in the participant list. Edith, I think, is here. I got to see her during that in-person training. So it's exciting to see some names that I'm familiar with. And of course, welcome to anyone new that did not get to attend that training in the first round. We are excited to have you. As Dr. Oliveras said, we are going to be providing these PLC sessions, and basically what they are is they will be coming at you once a month, and each session will deal with a smaller, more targeted area of teaching and learning. And we will go through some information for you, some resources for you, and we will work with you to practice applying some of these concepts that we talk about to your lesson plans as a teacher that you are working with currently. Did you
Before, yes. as Jennifer said, if you're part of the project, you attended the training. We also are about to announce, hopefully by the end of the day, if not by Monday, when is the makeup session for those that are participants of the project or are interns in one of the 2 participating institutions. So you can attend that makeup training, and it will be all virtual. So it's coming up here in a couple of weeks. So hopefully you can join us then.
Yes, and it is a fun training. It's got a lot of good resources in it. So hopefully we'll see a lot of you in that second round training. We had a lot of fun when we were there a couple of weeks ago, working with teachers and field supervisors and administrators. So this session today is just going to focus on your learning outcomes, Belize learning outcomes for the different standards that you work with or work for. We're going to take a closer look at those today. We're going to show you where to find them. We're going to look at their basic anatomy, what they look like, how they're made up and written. And we're also going to be taking them apart a little bit to create student objectives for your students in your lessons and in your classrooms. So that's what this session is primarily going to be focused on, is working with those learning outcomes. And then at the end, we have a little bonus for anybody that is going to be teaching online. I know some of you might be, some of you might not be, but you are more than welcome to stick around at the end of the session. We have a couple of resources for teachers, some online resources for teachers that may be putting information out to students in an online synchronous or asynchronous format. And if you know you are not going to be doing that online virtual aspect, you can still stick around if you want to, or you don't have to, just to share some of those resources for you. So as Dr. Olivares-Ortiz said, if you are a teacher or official participant of the SEE Belize project, so you have been receiving those notifications for the project, or if you are an intern at UB Stan Creek or Toledo, I think you said, Dr. Olivares?
Yeah, UB Toledo or Ecumenical Junior College.
Okay, so if you are one of those participants, you can go ahead and go to nearpod.com. You can go to join.nearpod.com. The link is kind of on the screen here, and enter the code that you see. Unfortunately, Nearpod has a limit of 75 participants, and we are very excited to see that we have a couple more on this Zoom session than 75. So we're trying to get the teachers that are part of the project into this Nearpod first. And then if there's extra room, we'll open it up, but I'm going to share my screen with you the whole time, so you'll get to see the Nearpod presentation no matter what. And so you won't miss out or anything. We just want to make sure that we get those participants in first. So you're going to join.nearpod.com, entering the code on the screen. Thank you, Hallie. Hallie put the link in the chat for you if you need a direct link to get there. Can everyone see the Nearpod presentation on the screen here?
Yes.
I think there's a way to get it bigger.
Yes.
I thought there was a way to get it bigger. Thank you. Let me move my stuff out of the way here. Okay, well, maybe not.
It's clear.
Okay, it's kind of small though, right? Maybe we'll do this.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. So the first thing that we're going to do, if you are logged into the Nearpod, which it looks like we only have 17 people logged into the Nearpod currently. So again, if you are an intern at one of the locations that Dr. Olivares mentioned, if you are a teacher involved in the SEE Belize project, please go ahead and go to join.nearpod.com, and the code's going to stay up here in the upper left-hand corner. So we'll give you guys just another minute to do that. And then we will see where we're at with other people being able to join. But the first thing we have today is just a poll.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Trying to find where could I log in for the code?
If you go to join, let me put it in the chat again. Oh, there's Hallie with our link. Hallie's putting the link in the chat. It's a direct link, join.nearpod.com. then you should be able to go straight there. But if not, you can do just join.nearpod.com and then enter the code, which is in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. That is H2NXQ is the code that goes with that. You might be able to just Google Nearpod to get there that way, if that direct link is not working for you, and enter the code. So the first thing we have is a little bit of a poll. We just want to know who's here today. We have a lot of participants. We're up to 147 participants, which is amazing. We're very excited about that. And we just want to know who we have here today. So please answer the poll if you are a teacher, an administrator, or a field supervisor, or other. So please let us know what category you fall into with us today. So you can see we have a good amount of teachers, some field supervisors. Lots of teachers, excellent. If you answered other, if you could just add in the chat box what your title is, or what you would consider in the other category. I am very excited to see a huge percentage of teachers here. That's really exciting. Hopefully what we have for you today is going to be helpful to you, useful to you. Okay, intern, student, teacher. I guess we probably could have put that on the poll, but I didn't think about it ahead of time. Excellent. So majority teachers, we've got some interns, school administrators, and field supervisors here as well. We are thankful for everybody that has joined us today. Like I said, we are going to focus today primarily on your learning outcomes. So if you have joined the Nearpod officially, you will be able to click on this link on the slide that's in front of you. If you are not joined to the Nearpod, I believe, Dr. Oliveras, can you put out a link to, thank you, to the learning outcomes? We're going to take a closer look at these learning outcomes. Dr. Oliveras has just put a link in the chat. If you are part of the Nearpod, you'll be able to click on this and look directly at it. If you are not, you can go ahead and click the link that is in the chat to have access to this. So this document contains, by grade level, the full list of learning outcomes from the National Curriculum Primary School, learning outcomes in all subjects. So you can see these links are hyperlinked here, so you can just jump directly to the standard or standards that you teach, and you can see a list of the learning outcomes for your standard. So we're going to be asking you in just a little bit to kind of look around in your standard and see what learning outcomes are there, because in just a little bit, you're going to be picking one of these learning outcomes to work with across our session today, to look at a little closer, to create some objectives from. So make sure that you have this document either start or saved or open on your screen so that you can kind of go back and forth between the Zoom session and this screen with the learning outcomes. This is primarily what we're going to be working with today.
If you tried accessing it and got an error message, I've fixed it. You should be able to refresh the page and access it.
Okay, so we'll give everybody a second just to make sure you have that document up and running. Let's do that link again. We'll put the link in the chat again to kind of refresh that. So if you are on the Nearpod, you are able to click on this directly. It looks like we're up to about 45, 46 participants on the Nearpod, which is awesome. Again, if you are a teacher or intern involved in the project, you can log on to the Nearpod.
Miria, if you are a teacher, even though you're not, go ahead and join since we have 47 people.
Okay, Dr. Oliveras, we're getting a comment about a more updated version of the learning outcomes.
Yeah, I've heard that was happening when we put the training materials together that had not been released. So if it's published, I'm glad to know that. For this activity, I think you'll be fine using this document, but I'm glad that you have mentioned that. I will make sure that we have the most current curriculum. But yeah, when we created the training this summer, actually in August, when we went down to Belize, it hadn't been published yet, but we will make sure that we have update our information. Thank you for letting us know.
Thank you for that information. And today we're just going to be looking primarily at the structure and the process of looking at a learning outcome and kind of deconstructing it to create an objective. So even if the content has changed a little bit of those learning outcomes in the more updated document, the process will still be the same. And so we'll be primarily focusing on the process and getting practice of deconstructing the learning outcomes to create objectives so that you can then go ahead and apply that same process to any updated version of outcomes or any future updated versions of learning outcomes as well, since the kind of cognitive process will be similar. So hopefully this will, that process will still be useful to you. So we're going to start out today with a couple of questions. Either in the chat box or you can go ahead and jump on the mic. Why do you think it is important to begin the lesson planning process with the learning outcomes? So you're a teacher and you have a class full of students and you know you need to plan for them. Why do you think it might be important to begin with the learning outcomes in your lesson planning process?
Because it gives you a specific idea of what you need to be learning that day or that particular subject.
Excellent, thank you. So it gives you an idea of what you need to be working through, the content you need to be introducing to the students. In the comments we have, because it's the guide and it tells you the extent you need to teach the kids so that you have a guide as to what you should cover with your students.
Good morning.
Excellent. So go ahead.
Good morning, Liz Palazzo here. It is important because when you unwrap your learning outcomes, you get your topics from the learning outcomes, what you will be teaching for the entire week or for the entire period at a specific time when you use the annual. So that is the reason why it is very, very important, because all your specific topics comes from your learning outcome.
Excellent, thank you. Federica, go ahead. Okay, we're getting some more answers in the chat. I love the comment that says, it tells us what we're supposed to teach, but it also tells us what the children should be able to accomplish after the lesson. I'm seeing a lot of answers about it guiding what you need to teach, the intended or expected learning goals for the students. Love these answers. You get your content and skills from the learning objectives or the learning outcomes. help and guide to well prepare and be aware what you intend to teach. I love it. Okay, so we are talking about learning outcomes first in our very first PLC session, because it makes sense that that's where you would start. As a teacher, when you are planning your lessons and your content and your material, you need to start with the learning outcomes. Because it is going to tell you exactly what content you need to provide to your students. It's also going to help you understand what content might have been covered in the standard before and what content might be covered in the standard after. So it can give you a little bit of vertical alignment information as well, so that you are able to know exactly kind of what your students need to master in that standard or across those couple standards while they are with you. In addition, if you are planning activities in your lesson and then going back to match learning outcomes with them, typically what happens is your lesson will be either too low or too high. It will not be appropriately aligned to the standard outcomes that they are expected to master. So it's really, really important that we begin here. We begin with the learning outcomes and we build everything in our lesson planning and instructional pieces from there. Deshaun, go ahead.
I'm sorry about that. My phone's giving trouble.
It's okay. We completely understand the whole online Zoom deal is a little weird to begin with, and sometimes internet does not work well. So we definitely understand that. We're just very thankful that everybody is here. We're up to 160 participants, so that's pretty exciting for us. Yes, the internet does not work very clearly all the time. So we're going to do the best that we can today, and y'all just kind of hang in there with us, and we appreciate you being here. So we established some really great reasons why beginning with learning outcomes is really, really important. So what we're going to talk about today is how to take those learning objectives and how to transform them into objectives, or your learning outcomes, and transform them into objectives that are student friendly and that are kind of guideposts for you in an individual lesson plan to know where your students need to begin and where the students need to end in order to master that learning outcome. And then, of course, as I said earlier, if you know you're going to be teaching online, we do have some resources at the end of this that we can provide to you. But thank you all for your participation and your input on starting with learning objectives. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a sample. So I have just pulled a standard 3 reading outcome called displaying word power. So you'll see that all of the learning outcomes are structured in a very similar manner. Of course, they're organized by standard, but they're also organized by structure, content, and skill. And they go from broad to very specific. And so when we start with standard 3 reading, we're going to see this particular skill is displaying word power. It's going to provide us with a little bit of a knowledge and skills statement under that. And what it says is use a range of vocabulary items to convey precise meaning, differentiate between words of similar meaning, homophones and homonyms, and analyze the structure of words. So that's what this particular learning outcome is going to cover. It's what it's made up of. It's what students are going to master. And then it gets a little bit more specific for you. So specifically, explain how some suffixes and prefixes are used to change the part of speech of a word. For example, culture as a noun, cultural as an adjective, or book as a noun and bookish as an adjective. And then also discuss and collect words of similar and opposite meanings. So you see the hierarchy kind of this standard is that it starts broad with standard 3 reading, and then it gets a little bit more specific for you as it goes down into some of those student expectations. So let's kind of pull that apart a little bit. When you are dealing with learning outcomes and expectations for students, you're essentially dealing with what we call the 3 C's. So when we're talking about the 3 C's, we're talking about content, we're talking about cognitive expectation, and we're talking about context. And what we mean by those three things is that content is specifically what you are teaching related to the concept or skills that will be addressed in the lesson. For example, if you are teaching reading, your content words in your learning outcomes are going to look different than if you are teaching a math lesson. So in a math lesson, you might see content words such as fractions, common denominators, but you won't see that vocabulary in your learning outcomes for reading. So we're going to be looking in our learning outcomes for specific content to help us understand what we need to be presenting to students. The second C is cognitive expectation. And this is what they're doing with their brain across the lesson, or what they're expected to be able to do with that content across the lesson. So for example, are they going to apply it? Are they going to analyze it? Are they going to explain it? Are they going to define it? So the cognitive expectation is what they are cognitively doing or being able to do with the content. And the last piece, the last C, is the context. And this is basically the specificity. So I know that my students are supposed to be able to apply concepts in math, but what specific concepts are they supposed to be applying, and how specifically are they supposed to be applying those concepts? And that's what the context will tell you. It's the observable and measurable behavior or activity that students will perform to prove their mastery. And so these three elements, the content, the cognitive expectation, and the context, can all be found inside of that learning outcome. So when we have a learning outcome in front of us, we're going to be looking for those three components so that we can then manipulate those components to build objectives. So we're going to be working with the 3 C's, practicing with that in just a minute. So let's look at our example. So if you have joined the Nearpod, what are we up to? We're up to 56 on the Nearpod. If you are actually in the Nearpod presentation, you will be able to physically do this along with me. If you are not in the presentation, then I have an example for you on the screen here that we are going to go through together as we look for these 3 C's. Because they're 3 C's, I see your comment, Leisha, about context. We're going to go through that right now, and I'm going to show you in this standard what each of those three C's look like in a real learning outcome. So the first thing we're going to look at is content. Then we said cognitive expectation, and then we said context. So as a little hint for you, we have like a little cheat sheet here of the terminology that is usually used in each of these components. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and highlight for these different components so you can see what they look like in this learning outcome. And then once we have gone through this together, I'm going to be asking you to find a learning outcome that you will use this year, or one, if you are an administrator or field supervisor, one that you're interested in looking closer at. And we are going to, I'm going to ask you to practice doing this on your own too, to find these components. So let's look first at the cognitive expectation, the verb. When we are looking at standard 3 reading, display word power, the first verb I see is use. What other verbs do you see in this beginning statement? Use a range of vocabulary items to convey precise meaning, differentiate between words of similar meaning, homophones and homonyms, and analyze the structure of words. What other verbs do you see in there? You can just put it in the chat box. What words, verbs you see? Differentiate, very good. That's one of our verbs. Analyze, very good. Okay, let's move down to more of our specific student expectations here. What do you see down here after 23.9 and 23.10? What verbs do you see in these particular components? Explain. Awesome. discuss, and what else? Collect. So again, we're looking for the cognitive expectation. We know that the students, for this particular learning outcome, the students will need to be able to use something, differentiate something, analyze something, explain something, discuss and collect something. These are all of the cognitive processes that they will need to go through in order to master this learning outcome. And so in this situation, defining something might not be enough. That's not high enough level just to define something or recall something. No, they need to analyze it. They need to differentiate it. They need to explain it. They need to discuss regarding the content. And so this gives you a great idea real quick, just picking out the verbs of your learning outcome, what level of rigor you're going to need to have the students engage in during their lesson to be successful with this learning outcome. If you have students in this situation, if you have students that are just reading out loud, if you have students that are just kind of writing definitions or memorizing definitions or matching or things like that, that's not going to be high enough level for this particular learning outcome. So it's a good, quick way to see cognitively what your students are going to have to do across the lesson. So now that we know cognitively what they're going to have to do, let's look at what they're going to have to do it with. Let's look at the content. So let's go back to the beginning when we picked out the word use. Well, what are they going to be using in this particular learning outcome? They're going to be using vocabulary items. That's what they are using. What color did I pick? Purple. They're going to be using vocabulary items. What are they differentiating between? Y'all throw it in the chat box. What are they differentiating between in this particular learning outcome? Words of similar meaning. Yep. Homophones and homonyms. Excellent. Thank you for your participation. And what are they going to be analyzing in this particular learning outcome? So they're using vocabulary items. They're differentiating between words of similar meaning, homophones and homonyms, and they're analyzing the structure of words. Very good. Notice the words vocabulary items, looking at homophones, homonyms, the structure of words themselves. Those are all very much reading content related. You may be dealing with vocabulary items in other content areas, but you're probably not going to be looking at homophones, homonyms, or structure of words in those other areas. So notice how some of that specific content is coming out here when we look for the nouns. So let's go to 23.9 and 23.10 to find the content there as well. So we said that in 23.9, they were going to have to explain something. What is the content that they are explaining? What is the noun here? What are they explaining? Good. Suffixes and prefixes is one thing that they are explaining. And they are words of similar and opposite meanings. Good. So in 23.10, they are discussing and they are collecting words of similar. Actually, they're really just discussing and collecting words because the rest of that is going to be part of the context. So good. So if you look at this now, basically you have a really quick picture and idea of what the main basis for this learning outcome is going to be. You know what they have to do cognitively, you know the specific content that they need to do that with, and now the only thing that remains is how. Because as a reading teacher, when you are teaching students how to read, explaining suffixes and prefixes, that's a big thing to tackle. There's a lot you could do with that. And so your learning outcomes have provided some more information for you. They've provided some specificity to help you as the teacher kind of narrow down that content even further. And that's going to be the context. So let's go back to the beginning here of our standard 3 reading display word power learning outcome. We said that they are going to use vocabulary items, but specifically, they're not just going to use vocabulary items any way we want them to. They're specifically going to use vocabulary items to do what? To convey precise meaning. Yes, excellent. So they're using a range of vocabulary items to convey precise meaning. That gives you a little bit more information about what they're supposed to do with those vocabulary items. They're also differentiating between words of similar meaning, homophones and homonyms, and analyzing the structure of words with that as well. And then we see more specificity and context come in 23.9. So they're not just explaining suffixes and prefixes, they're specifically explaining how those things are used to change the part of speech of a word. That's the specificity here. We're not just going to introduce what a prefix is and what a suffix is and go from there. That's not high enough level for this learning outcome. They need to know what they are, but they also then need to explain how those things are used to change the part of speech of a word. That is much higher level than just knowing what a prefix and suffix are. So that specificity in this situation is very, very important for you as a teacher, so that you know that not only do they need to define those things, but they need to be able to explain the impact that prefixes and suffixes have on part of speech. Now, the cool thing about this learning outcome, and I didn't even do this on purpose, I just randomly chose one, but this specific learning outcome has specificity for its specificity. So not only are you going to talk about how suffixes and prefixes are used to change the part of speech of a word, but specifically these examples: culture and cultural, book and bookish. It gives you even more detail and information to show you some examples of what are some things you might cover within this context. So right here, you can see the complexity of this learning outcome. Now, this is just one learning outcome in one standard, in one content. But you can see here, as we're moving through this, how important it is to not only start with your learning outcomes, but to really, really dive deep into your learning outcomes to see exactly what the students need to be engaged with content, and exactly what level they need to be at cognitively with the content that you provide them. So again, you might look at this and think we're just going to do a lesson on suffixes and prefixes, homophones and homonyms, but that for this particular learning outcome, that would not be high enough. That would not be aligned to the rigor that this learning outcome is expecting of the students. So let's look at the last part, 23.10. Discuss and collect words. If that was all it said, man, we could have fun with that. We could have them discuss anything and collect any type of words that we wanted them to. But the specificity here is similar and opposite meanings. So we know we're dealing with synonyms and antonyms here. And that's the specificity for you. So at this point, we've gone through one learning outcome and we have really torn it apart. We know exactly the cognitive rigor that is expected here. We know the exact specific type of content they're going to engage with, and exactly how, as a teacher, we are going to pull that together for them. And we've done that through the 3 C's: the content, the cognitive expectation, and the context. Are there any questions about this? Because in just a minute, I'm going to give you some time to pull a learning outcome, anyone you want, and go through this same process doing that. So are there any questions on the 3 C's or what you see on the screen in front of you?
Can you see Jaime just raise his hand?
Oh. Yes, go ahead if you have a question.
Mr. Bangaña, do you have a question?
Okay, if you do have a question, you could throw it in the chat box or you can jump on the mic. But what I'd like you to do right now is go back to our learning outcomes document and go ahead and look through there and pick a learning outcome. It can be anyone you want to pick. It could be a standard, one of the standards that you teach. If you're, like I said, if you're an administrator or a field supervisor, you can kind of peruse through and pick one that you would like to go through this process with, and take a minute to look at it and see if you can pick out the verbs, the cognitive expectation verbs, the content nouns, and the context, just like we did here. And you can choose to write this down where you are, if you are a hands-on person, or you can work on your computer as well if you would like to. But go ahead, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to work through that. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask while we're working on this.
As you're going through this process, I don't know if Miss Jennifer said this, my grandmother came in and started talking to me, but if you have any questions, as you're going through it, please unmute and ask. That is why she's here, or we're here to help you through this process.
Jennifer, Matthias Virus here, just a comment. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Hey, Matt.
Yes. So looking at the example that you did there, I think it's important for the teachers to understand that what you have there is the standard and two outcomes. So the one on the top where it says use a range of vocabulary terms, that's the standard, right? And then you have 23.9, 23.10, those are the outcomes. And so you'll notice that that standard has more cognitive expectation that is achievable in those outcomes. So there might be more outcomes that will help address that standard. So I think it's important for them to understand that.
Thank you so much for that input. Yes, definitely looking at the bigger standard at the top will have a lot of higher level cognitive expectation. And then those outcomes underneath are helping you step them up to that standard. Excellent input. Thank you so much.
Jennifer, are you reading the chat?
Let's see here. Okay, some questions in the chat. When you pick a learning outcome for our purposes here, yes, it can definitely be any subject. And we have some great examples in the chat of Raquel specifically deconstructing one of those learning outcomes. So we'll give just a few more minutes for you to look through your learning outcome or outcomes and start to deconstruct a little bit by the 3 C's before we go ahead and move on. So just a few more minutes. So Rosalie has noted in the chat that language arts is moving to strands. Yes, and as those, as we spoke about before, as those things kind of change and update as they will, of course, as we learn more about student learning, as content grows and changes and evolves, those things, these resources will change as well. The important thing here is that this process is happening. So as a teacher, when you are looking at your lesson plans, you are going through this process with the outcomes that you have in front of you, the standards and the outcomes that you have in front of you, that you are, before you are planning your activities, you are very well aware of what the learning outcomes are expecting of your students, specifically, cognitively, content-wise. And so even if it's moving to a different structure as far as strands versus the way it's listed out here, even if the verbiage changes or some of the content of these standards and outcomes changes in the upcoming years or what have you, the important thing to remember is that this process is happening and needs to happen as a teacher. Instead of choosing an activity, or instead of looking at a standard, scanning it for content and thinking, okay, this lesson is going to be about prefixes and suffixes, I'm forcing myself as a teacher to go a little bit deeper into this learning outcome or into these expectations to really, really understand what it's asking my students to be responsible for, so that I can do the best that I can do to provide them with an opportunity to practice these skills and step these skills into mastery, so that at the end of the year, they're able to do these skills at a high level and the level that these outcomes are expecting of them. So even if the materials and the resources are changing, that's okay. This process is still going to be the same. You're still going to be looking for these 3 C's in your documents, if that makes sense. So I love some of the examples that are in the chat. I love some of the standards and outcomes that you have put in the chat. It seems like most of you have a really excellent idea of the 3 C's, the content, the cognitive expectation, and the context. That's excellent. You can give yourselves a pat on the back. That's definitely a good skill moving forward as we're looking at these learning outcomes. So thank you all for your participation on that. That was part 1. So part 1 was being able to look at a learning outcome and kind of pick it apart to find out more about it, to get to know it, to see what as teachers we need to do in our lessons. So the next step then is to turn this information.
Jennifer,
into...
just one comment before you proceed.
Go ahead.
All right.
Sure.
So, and I know we're looking at the 3 C's, right, and the cognitive expectation, but I just want to remind the teachers and interns that there will be some outcomes that will not have cognitive expectation, but would rather have a psychomotor expectation or an affective expectation. So depends on the subject area. So just be mindful of that.
Thank you. That is an excellent, excellent point. If you're looking at activities and expectations that are psychomotor, you'll see that reflected. Thank you for pointing that out. So it will always be content and context, but depending on the subject, some of these outcomes will have different expectations depending on what the skill is covering. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Still important to go through the process and know and be able to differentiate these 3 elements so that you know what to provide for them in your lesson plans. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Okay, so how does everybody feel about looking at your standards and learning outcomes a little bit closer? Is that making sense? Good. Excellent. Okay, so like I said, the next step, now that we know a little bit more about what our specific standard or learning outcome is asking of us, we want to go ahead and take that information and turn it into an objective for our students. It's really important for you as the teacher to be able to take the language of the learning outcome and put it in a context that is helpful for you to follow step by step, but also in a context that makes sense for students to be able to follow their own learning as well. And so as Dr. Matt pointed out, some of these standards have very high level expectations for students. The rigor is very high, the expectation is very high level. And it's going to be impossible for us as teachers to start out day 1, lesson 1, activity 1 on that high level. We have to step them there through our objectives. And so now that we know more about what our learning outcomes are going to require of our students, we are going to start writing objectives to help our students get to mastery of that learning outcome. So on the screen here, I have a very, very basic template for a learning objective. If you are a new starting intern, or if you are a new teacher and you are unsure of how to write objectives, this fill in the blank template, as you could call it, is a great place to start. Of course, we can get more specific with this and we can edit this to be a little bit better, but this is kind of where we're going to start for the purposes of our session today. And this will be the last thing that we kind of cover before we're done with our session for today. So we're going to go back to our example here. And we're going to make this so that we can see it. And we're just going to start with this kind of fill in the blank template. Now, as Dr. Matt noted, sometimes the expectation will not be cognitive, but you can still kind of use this same approach, even if the expectation is not a cognitive one, it's a psychomotor one, you just replace that here. So you want to start out your objectives with what the learner will be able to accomplish so that the student knows step by step what it is they have to accomplish in your lesson for that day. So for this one, we're going to take Dr. Matt's advice and we're going to go to the specific outcomes because this is kind of where it starts and where it begins. And we know that in 23.9, we're going to have to, the students are going to have to explain how some suffixes and prefixes are used to change the part of speech of a word. So let's think through that for a minute. In order for them to be able to explain how suffixes and prefixes impact words, how might you get them there? Students are not going to immediately be able to walk into your classroom and say, oh, I know how a suffix affects the meaning of a word. So what are some skills? What are some maybe simpler skills that they're going to need to master in order to be able to explain how suffixes and prefixes impact words? Well, the first thing is they're going to need to know what a prefix and a suffix is, right? If they don't know that, they're not going to be able to move on and explain how it impacts things. So one of the first objectives we might be able to write here would look something like the learner will define suffixes and prefixes. With vocabulary words. By collaborating with peers. So I've just kind of used this fill in the blank to write a simple objective, because our learners are going to have to be able to define suffixes and prefixes before they can move on to explain the impact on parts of speech. Now, this is where I was saying earlier that if we stopped here, if this was our only lesson, we were just introducing prefixes and suffixes, we were just defining them, that would not allow the student to meet the rigor of the expectation of this learning outcome. However, it is okay to have a learning objective that starts here, because as a teacher, we know we have all sorts of levels in our classroom, and we want our learning objectives to start with the basics and kind of step them up to that higher level of the standard. This is the trajectory of our lesson plan. This is kind of the chronological order that students are going to go in to be able to master that higher level skill. So we know they're going to have to be able to define suffixes and prefixes. Notice I added just a little activity there about looking at vocabulary words with their peers. Maybe you can give them a bunch of words that have prefixes and suffixes, and they just can kind of explore what that means for a little bit, some definitions. And that is a basic objective that you can have for your lesson plan. Now, once they are able to do that, we can walk around as a teacher and see that the suffixes and the prefixes are going well. Students are understanding what that is. What do you think might be the next step here to get them to master learning outcome 23.9? So they know what a prefix is, they know what a suffix is. What is next, do you think? So you can add that in the chat, or you can jump on the mic. They've defined suffixes and prefixes. What do they have to do next in order to meet this outcome, do you think?
Miss, differentiate between what is a suffix and a prefix?
Excellent. So knowing the difference between the two, let's jot down some of these ideas. We have one in the chat.
Will we be able to give example of them?
Prefixes and suffixes. Okay. Now let's look at the rest of the learning outcome, because this is what we're basing this on. This is what we want them to get to. They're using suffixes and prefixes. They're using them to explain how they change the part of speech of a word. So I love these ideas that y'all are throwing out there, differentiating between prefixes and suffixes, giving examples of prefixes and suffixes. That's great. That is excellent. And we can use, actually, we could put some of this terminology in our first objective listed here, because within being able to define suffixes and prefixes, maybe we want to say the learner will be able to define and differentiate between. Right? Because remember, we don't want to spend our whole lesson on just prefixes and suffixes. We don't want to fall into that trap. Even though some students might be struggling with this concept, our learning objectives are going to be our map, our roadmap to mastering that learning outcome. So if our first objective is mastering suffixes and prefixes, then our second objective could be mastering the second piece of content in this learning outcome, which is talking about part of speech, right? Because a student would need to understand the different parts of speech and what that means, what is an adjective versus what is a verb versus what is a noun, in order to be able to show the relationship between those things. So the first piece of content we have in 23.9 is talking about suffixes and prefixes. We have an objective for that. We are good to go. The next part of content listed in our learning outcome is the part of speech. So we can create an objective for that. The learner will, now what do you think about part of speech? You guys had some great examples here for different cognitive expectations for part of speech. So let me ask you what you think the students would need to do here. Do you think they just need to be able to define parts of speech? Do you think they need to be able to apply, use it, differentiate between the different parts of speech? What do you think would be a good cognitive expectation for a standard 3 student here? So if we're talking about parts of speech for a standard 3 student, do you think we need to make sure that they can just define the parts of speech? Do you think we need to make sure that they can differentiate between, list examples of? What do you think we need to do here looking at this learning outcome? 23.9. You can throw any ideas you have in the chat or jump on the mic.
Identify and differentiate between the different parts of speech.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. Yes, identify and differentiate between. I like that. Identify and differentiate between different parts, or we could just say parts of speech. And we can add through maybe class discussion. And again, these end pieces can change as you are deciding what activity might be best to pair with this cognitive skill and this content. But for right now, we just want to make sure that we have the basic elements of our kind of fill in the blank template here, and that we are stepping everything we need to step up to that learning outcome. So excellent. So we have suffixes and prefixes. Check. We've covered that. That's the first thing we're going to talk about with our students in this lesson. They've got it. They're good. We get the green light. We move on to differentiating between parts of speech. We're going to have a class discussion on that. Okay, so at this point, we know that students are able to understand what a prefix and suffix is and differentiate between the two. They are able to understand what the different parts of speech are and what the differences are between them. So now we are ready to go a little bit more complex with this. So the learner will, and now we can kind of match the outcome or work them up to the outcome, since they are able to now combine the relationship between these things. So we're going to use the same word that the outcome is wanting them to use for their cognitive expectation, because we want to ensure that they're able to do this. I want to see as a teacher that they are able to explain this appropriately. So the learner will explain the impact of prefixes and suffixes on parts of speech. By, I'm just going to use collaborating with peers again. Again, these are very, very basic. And as you go through planning your activities, we can certainly amend these and make these objectives a little bit better. But for right now, we would just want to make sure that we have the basic elements. So here we have in front of us 3 objectives for a lesson for learning outcome 23.9. And we have identified the first element of content they need to know, suffixes and prefixes. We've identified the second element of content they need to know, parts of speech. And then we can finally allow them and coach them through talking about that relationship and looking into how those things affect one another. Once we've gotten them there, we're good. They have mastered this learning outcome. So that's just a quick example of how you can take all of the work that you've done on deconstructing these standards and outcomes and kind of allow yourself to think through the steps students are going to need to go through to be able to get up to the level of mastery that they need in these learning outcomes. So you can see how my objectives match that learning outcome. They are written directly from that learning outcome. And this is a good gauge for me as the teacher to be able to see where students are stuck. Maybe I have a student that's struggling, and instead of wondering what they're struggling with, I can see that they understand prefixes and suffixes, but they're stuck on basic parts of speech because they can't, they're not able to reach that objective. So for me, that gives me a very good specific idea of how I need to monitor and adjust for that specific student to help them be successful. I'm just seeing these examples in the chat. Ooh, I'm loving some of these ideas. So we have some ideas in the chat of activities that you could do with this. And I knew that you guys were going to be idea generators. So once we have looked at the learning outcome, the standards, and we know exactly what they need to do cognitively, psychomotor, whatever it is, we know the content we need to expose them to, and we know the specificity of it. Then we can write these clear roadmap objectives that step the students up to that level of mastery and that level of rigor, and be able to be successful in this particular learning outcome. So now I know I've got a great foundation for my lesson plan, and now I know I can go and explore activities just like you guys are putting in the chat. I know I can go and explore activities that are related to this standard and know that it's going to be aligned to the outcome. So Dr. Matt, I love that you point out that differentiate is a cognitive skill that is above the cognitive skill of explaining suffixes and prefixes. And I think that in that aspect, because differentiating between just one element, parts of speech, the parts of speech content is a little bit lower level than the multi-complex content of this objective. So if they are able to differentiate between some of these isolated content pieces, and even though that's a higher skill, then they're going to be able to explain the relationship between all of these pieces up there. At least that's what I'm thinking going through these learning objectives.
Yeah, so my point there is that it's important that the teachers don't overteach, because they might engage the students in cognitive overload, right? So when you look at the standards, you don't want to just look at one or two outcomes. You have to look at all the outcomes that address that entire standards. Then you plan your lessons based on the standards. So differentiate might come in another standard later on, and so they can build on that later on. Because I know differentiate is necessary to accomplish the standards, because it's there in the standards, but it's not in those particular outcomes that have been identified.
Excellent, thank you. And that's an important piece to note as well, that a lot of times we're not maybe looking at just one single outcome. We might be looking at combining a couple of outcomes in a lesson plan, but as Dr. Matt said, it's very important also to know the scope and the range of your outcomes as the big picture, and get familiar with those learning outcomes across the reading content for your standard or across the math content for your standard. So like he said, you would know in this instance if the next step, if a skill later on is going to be for them to differentiate or not. You'd be able to write even better objectives in this particular situation. So knowing the scope of your learning objectives is just as important as identifying what is inside those learning objectives too. So thank you, Dr. Matt, for pointing that out. That's very important to note. So at this point, we have looked at taking an example of a learning outcome in a standard and kind of diving into what it's expecting of our students. We've done a basic overview of how to create those objectives to step everybody up to that. So the last thing we're going to do today, before we kind of ask for your feedback for future sessions, and then ask you if you want to stick around for some of those online resources, what I would like you to do is take that learning outcome that you picked earlier, the learning outcome that you picked for the activity where you deconstructed it, and just write an objective, one objective to go with it. You can write a couple objectives if you feel confident doing that. Again, if you are in the Nearpod, we have 57 participants. If you are in the Nearpod, you are going to be able to write your objective in there and actually put it on this page. But if you are not in the Nearpod, you can also just put it in the chat box. Just tell us what learning outcome you chose. So go ahead and put your learning outcome there, and then tell us what objective you have written. Write the objective that you think would go with that in the chat box or in the Nearpod. So we're going to give just a couple of minutes for you to go back to that learning objective that we just kind of deconstructed and write a learning objective to go with it, and go ahead and put it in the chat or in the Nearpod. And then, of course, like before, if you have any questions while you're working through it, please let us know and we will help you out. So again, please make sure to include the standard that you chose, the outcome that you chose, and one learning objective that you have written to go with it. So the learning outcome you chose, and then an objective you have written to go with it. Give everybody just a few more minutes to wrap that up. So we are taking the learning objective that you pulled out earlier to deconstruct, and we're just writing one objective to go with that. I see some excellent responses in the Nearpod, and we still have the example on the screen here. So we'll just do maybe like 1 or 2 minutes. If you could share with us the outcome you chose and the objective you wrote in the chat box or in the Nearpod, and then in a minute or two, we will wrap up. Thank you all for your participation on that. I'm seeing a great start with writing objectives and looking through those learning outcomes and being able to align the content and align the expectation of the learning outcomes. So excellent job. And I have really appreciated your participation in this session. And hopefully there will be some tidbits in here that you can take with you and help you this school year get to know your learning outcomes, whether that might be a changed format or not, but get to know your learning outcomes a little bit better and to be able to align your lesson plans a little bit better as well. I know some of you are still working on submitting your objective, but at this point, the last piece that we had, and this is kind of a guinea pig thing, I've never tried this in a Zoom session before, and so hopefully this will work. But if you are in the Nearpod, hopefully you will be able to go ahead and add a response to Flipgrid for us. So you can see if you're in the Nearpod, hopefully you'll be able to add a response. If you are not right in the Nearpod, if you could go to flipgrid.com and join using this join code. Again, I'm not sure that this is going to work out perfectly, but we're going to give it a shot and we're going to see, because it would be awesome to be able to see some of you and be able to get your feedback that way. So we're going to try this first. So if you are in the Nearpod, hopefully you are able to get a response going. If you are not in the Nearpod, if you can go to flipgrid.com and then enter the code, the join code, see if that works for you. If that does not work for you, what I'd like you to do, or if it's just easier for you, what I'd like you to do is give us a little bit of feedback regarding future sessions. So in these upcoming PLC sessions that we do, again, like I said, we're going to be focusing on some pretty targeted pieces of teaching and learning and lesson planning and instruction. And so we'd love to get your feedback on some ideas of concepts that we can cover in some of these PLCs. So what would you like to see in upcoming PLC sessions like this, content-wise? Do you want one for assessments? Do you want one for differentiation? Do you want one for technology? What are some ideas that you have? You can give the Flipgrid a try. If that's not working out for you, then please add it in the chat so that we have that feedback. But we want to know, what would you like to see covered? What content would you like to see covered in future PLC sessions that we might do with you? I'm seeing some excellent ideas come through the chat. Once you have told us, either via chat or Flipgrid, what you would like to see in future sessions, you can either go ahead and have a great day and log off, or you can hang around for just a minute. I have a couple of online resources. If you know you're going to be teaching online to some degree this year, you can hang around for some quick resources I'm going to share with you, some free resources online. If you know that that is not you, you're not going to be teaching online in any capacity this year, then please just leave your feedback for us for future sessions in the chat or on Flipgrid, and then you are good to go. So we'll leave a minute or two for you to leave your feedback, and then I will start working on the online resources, but please know that you are free to leave at any time.
I do want to make a comment, Ms. Jennifer, that I know those of you that are working with packets and will have to create packets for your students. I think the activity that you went through today with where you study and really deconstruct the standards or the learning outcomes is really important, because we oftentimes, especially when we're talking about paper and pencil, right, we oftentimes think about, it's just basic knowledge or at a lower rigor or level. So make sure you analyze those standards and really think about different activities that the students can complete in, at home that address the level or the cognitive expectations for those standards. If you need help with those, please feel free to reach out to us. We can certainly put some, suggestions or some resources, provide some resources for you related to those. So I know packets are a challenge, especially when you're trying to push them to think critically and at a higher level of thinking. But let us know if you need help with that, and we can definitely provide some resources.
Okay, so as you finish up giving us some ideas about future sessions, again, if you are logged into the Nearpod, you're going to be able to see some specific resources for in-person instruction versus virtual instruction. Some of this is something that can be used for synchronous instruction if you're on a live Zoom like we are now. Some of it can be used for asynchronous if you are just pushing material out to students in that aspect. But just wanted to provide you, very quickly, I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat about interest in online resources. So we may look at developing a session that is geared towards some of those online resources, which would give me the opportunity to go a little bit more in detail about some of these resources I'm going to share with you. But For today, I just wanted to end today kind of giving you a couple of things to explore on your own, to kind of look into, maybe sign up for a free account and see if it's something that you might be interested in using. And then kind of go from there. We don't have a lot of time to go into the details of these resources, but I did want to go ahead and kind of get them out there so that you can start looking at them if you'd like to look at them. So let's see what I have here in my taskbar. If I can get this thing to disappear. Get this bar down here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, y'all. So, of course, we have Flipgrid is one of the things that is a good resource to use. You can create a free account on Flipgrid. This requires students to have access to some sort of camera to record. So if this is not possible for your students to do, this may not be a great resource for you, but it could be something to look into if you think your students would have access to that. And basically this is video collaboration. So students are able to record a short video answering whatever question you have posed for them, and they can see each other's videos, respond to each other. And it's a good way if you are virtual and you're not seeing them in person, it would be a good way for them to be able to see each other's faces. And kind of have some of that human connection without having the human connection. But again, you definitely wouldn't need video access for this, or students would need to be able to video for this one. But if you just go to flipgrid.com, it'll kind of walk you through getting signed up if you want to explore some of that. And I will follow up too with some handy handouts and easy quick start guides and things like that, if that's something that you're interested in. Again, I just want you to see these things and go visit them and explore them and see if they'll work for you or not. Another resource I had was Nearpod. So the presentation that I worked through today was done through a Nearpod. A Nearpod is just an online presentation that has interactive elements embedded. It is another free product that you can sign up for free. Students do not need to create an account. They can just get into it with a code like some of you did today, which is a plus. They don't have to necessarily add an app. They can just go to the browser and put the code in, and they are ready to go. But when you are creating a lesson, there's a lot of options for you to add content. So when you are adding, you can embed a video in here. You can take them to a different website. You can put one of a slideshow you already made in there. You can include a link to a PDF of a worksheet or something you might want them to do. So lots of options for content. And then this is the coolest part to me, is it's got the activities built in. So with Nearpod, you can essentially put a quiz at the end of a presentation, and in one link, one presentation, you have a lesson for your students and you have an assessment for them at the end as well. So lots of good options here with building in some of that interactivity. If you know students are going to need to work through this, this has an option that you can assign it as student pace, or you can assign it live. So I did my presentation today live, which allowed me to control what slides you were seeing as I was going through, but you could also do it student paced and then just post a link and a code, and the students can work through it on their own at their own pace. So that's a good option for you to be able to provide material to your students, but also have an assessment built in or some sort of interaction built in, so they're not just reading material or reading a worksheet or reading slides. They're actually able to submit a short answer, or they're able to do a quiz built in or a poll built in there. So Nearpod is one of my favorites. We used it for the online folks last couple weeks ago when we were there for our teacher training. We're going to use it again in the upcoming training. And I used it today. So it's one of my favorite things to use. It is free to sign up, so you can play around with that. Let me check my chat here. Okay, and then Edpuzzle is another one I wanted to show you. It's just edpuzzle.com, and basically you're picking a video for them to watch, and then you are embedding questions and assignments into the video. So you can have it stop 2 minutes into the video and ask them a question. And so it's just kind of a guided way to push a video of content out to your students, but also ensure that they're watching it by putting questions embedded within. So another good free resource, you sign up for a free account, you can kind of explore that. But again, this one would require students to be able to stream a video on their device, which might not be possible for a lot of your students. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking through this as well. Some of you had asked about assessments, online formative assessments. There are a couple of resources. These are the last 3 resources I'm going to show you before we are done for the day. This is called wiser.me, another free resource. And basically you take a paper worksheet that you have and you're going to turn it into an interactive online worksheet. So this is good if you have students that are able to receive electronic worksheets or go to this website and put the code in, and you can get that information electronically without them having to scan something in or drop something off or mail it or whatever they have to do. So this is a good one to take a worksheet that you might already have made as a physical tool that you would use in person in your classroom and kind of turn it into an online version of that same worksheet. So that's something for you to explore, just called wiser.me. Is a good one, also free. And then the last 2 you actually might already be familiar with, but it's Quizlet and Quiziz. And Quizlet and Quiziz are both a similar format of assessments online. So Quizlet has tons of different vocabulary words in there already created that students can study, play games with, take quizzes with. But it also allows you as the teacher to create vocabulary cards, create quizzes, track data, that sort of thing. But this is a great resource for students for vocabulary, to study and practice vocabulary, to be able to take a quiz on vocabulary, all online. So this is great formative assessment for vocabulary. And then Quizzes is a very, very similar website, except you can put any kind of quiz in there. It doesn't necessarily have to be vocab related. You can do any kind of quiz on here and have your students prepare for it and take the quiz. Both of these platforms have a live option where if you wanted to, if you were synchronous and doing it live, the students could participate together at the same time, but they don't have to. So these are just two good, again, free formative assessment tools. Students don't need to create an account, but most all of these things I showed you today, students don't need to create an account. They just need to go to a link you provide and put in a code you provide. And so that's kind of why I highlighted these resources. You've got your assessments here with Quizlet and Quizzes. You've got your interactive worksheets, interactive videos, interactive presentations with Nearpod. And then if you wanted to check out the video piece, you could. But those are all I've kind of pulled aside to show you for today. If you want to explore any of those resources and see if they might work for you and your students this year, that would be awesome. I'd love your feedback. If you do end up using one of these resources, I'd love to hear about it. But for now, you can go ahead and explore some of these websites and have fun figuring out if you would like to use that or if it would work for you. And then we will be looking at your feedback that you have put in chat or Flipgrid to develop some of the future sessions that we do for these PLCs. This one was kind of long. I think other ones will be maybe a little bit shorter than this one. But we are blown away by the participation and how many people are logged on today. I'm so excited that you are all here. I hope that there were a couple of helpful things that you can take and use for you this year. It was nice to see some familiar names and very excited to meet some of the new names in here and excited to see you guys in future sessions. Dr. Oliveras, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add before we kind of sign off.
No, just wanted you to know that our plan is to host a PLC the first Friday of every month. We're hoping that this time will work for everybody, especially Jennifer. But if there's a change in time, we will notify you with enough time so you know. But for now, let's plan on meeting every first Friday of the month. Thank you,
Jennifer,
Jennifer.
I could make a comment before we end, please.
Yes.
For the wonderful apps, for the app with the Flipgrid that involves the recording, I would want the teachers and the principals involved in the session to be aware that we have to be careful with the recording of students and in terms of issues of privacy and confidentiality and ensuring that we get parental consent for students recording and how those recordings will be stored and saved for the protection of the students. No? So that's very important that needs to be considered and addressed.
Dr. Matt, that is the administrator in you. Once an administrator, always an administrator. But yes,
Yes.
So, but yes, that is really, really important. Great point.
That's all we have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you all in future sessions.
Thank you.